Nvidia sinking in pre-market after Chinese officials announced an antitrust probe into the U.S. chipmaker. Joining us now, let's bring in Dan Newman, who is the Futurum Group CEO. Dan, you see a headline like this come across, got to wonder what goes through your mind, especially as this goes directly at the poster child of the AI trade.
Yeah, Brad, good morning. First of all, nobody should be surprised to hear about an ongoing set of probes against Nvidia, especially coming from China. Now, there's sort of two sides to this one. There's the first, which is the more ongoing microaggressions that exist between Chinese and US firms. And of course, as China continues to struggle to keep up with the most leading edge advanced AI chips, they probably want to do what they can to slow US firms down. On the other side, China's talking about a 4-year-old commitment that came from Nvidia to make sure that Mellanox, which is the networking technology that they've bought that's really enabled Nvidia to continue to create differentiation in these systems that they're building, and saying, hey, is Nvidia helping enough with Chinese-made chips and using this networking technology to advance what China is doing? And of course, that's a challenge too, because China is so far behind right now due to a combination of controls, a lack of the materials and technologies to build the most modern AI chips. So I think what we have here is really more of a macro geopolitical strain than a real probe. But Nvidia is so successful that they're going to get probed by every regulator in the world over the next few years.
Do you see it, Dan, I guess, having a significant impact just on the roadmap there in China, what that future strategy looks like? And you talk about the fact that this is a really a geopolitical headline. I guess then my follow-up would be, how big of a risk maybe does this, or how big of a risk signal is this to some of the other larger chip players who do still have exposure to China?
Every company is right now looking at the calculus of their business in China. We see companies like Qualcomm, Intel, AMD, all have double-digit percentage market share in China. And of course, they want to continue to sell into China. We also know that President-elect Donald Trump is planning to put some pretty strict tariffs into place. Now, of course, I always put a balance there because President-elect Trump does not want to harm the markets in any ways. I think a lot of his campaign was on creating a strong stock market economy. And of course, these firms like Nvidia are such a big weight on the indexes. He doesn't want to see them get harmed. But at the same time, we don't want to continue to feed China with the best and most advanced technology. And that comes from many of our companies, not just Nvidia. That comes from our cloud computing leaders like Microsoft and Google. That, of course, comes from our OEMs, the Dells and of course, the Lenovo's and other companies here that are really large selling systems, HPEs. And so they really have to think about how they manage that relationship. But I think as a whole, every company has to worry because China is such a large consumer of products and, of course, technology leadership from the U.S.
In any tit-for-tat kind of scenario that we see play out, it's typically the companies that have the largest revenue exposure to China that we see have a bit of a pullback here as investors start to recalculate what the interim period at least holds. Based on what we've seen before, and then what we've also seen before in exemptions, what type of exemptions are you anticipating, and what even quantifiable pullback could be on the table if we were to see this play out in a broader kind of tit-for-tat that impacts some of the largest U.S. companies that have the most revenue exposure to China?
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen a little bit of this play out in the real world. We've seen Micron get significant challenge from China. That impacted revenue substantially. And before that sort of big high bandwidth memory pivot that happened over the last year with AI, it really harmed Micron. And then, of course, we recently heard some probes into Intel and the business that's going on with Intel. And of course, we know Intel has been in a delicate position. So Nvidia is a little bit of a different play. And there's been this ongoing sort of moving target of creating these scaled back AI chips that could work in the China market. But recently we heard, anything below 7 nanometer, they were going to cut off through these new export controls. That's basically every chip that's been designed recently for that market. And so you're talking a multi-billion-dollar impact, double-digit % revenue for Nvidia, not as high as some companies. Others like Qualcomm have even higher exposure. But we expect this to continue to play out. There just is no circumstance until, over the next few years that China and the US aren't going to continue to strain, because AI is not just about this technology. It's really about global economic and defense leadership. And the US doesn't want to weaken its position.
Dan, when you take a look at the reaction that we're seeing in pre-market here today, you've got shares off just about 2%. That move to the downside, is that a bit of an overreaction, or is it something that maybe does make sense given some of those longer term concerns?
I expect a series of ongoing probes that will take place. I think this will hit the news cycles every quarter or two with a different part of the world probing Nvidia. I think some investors may get a little bit spooked when these things happen. China, of course, is such a large market, but we also have to let this play out because, like I said, I mean, the growth of Nvidia, they can barely fulfill all the demand outside of China right now. The growth is so incredible, but this is also a company that's run up to around a $3.5 trillion market cap. So there's also going to be breathing periods. And I think investors may look for moments and signals to maybe sell, take some profits, and then possibly re-enter if there's a meaningful pullback. But I think it's just the beginning for NVIDIA and this entire AI trend, which I heard your guest before talking about the exact same thing.